Everyone feared the Mafia Boss, but on the night he needed help the most, the only person who stopped for him was the woman nobody ever noticed. The city of Blackridge was a place where names carried weight. Wealth opened doors, influence changed decisions, and powerful people rarely had to ask twice for anything. At the center of that world stood Alexander Whitmore, a man known by many but truly understood by almost no one. At 41 years old, Alexander had built an empire through discipline, intelligence, and a reputation that made people choose their words carefully around him. To the public, he was the mafia boss who seemed untouchable. He lived in a world of luxury, private meetings, and endless expectations. Yet behind the expensive suits and quiet confidence was a man who had grown used to one painful truth. Most people only saw what he could provide, not who he really was. While Alexander moved through a world of power, Grace Carter lived in a completely different reality. At 29 years old, she worked long hours as a maid at an upscale hotel in the heart of the city. She was the kind of person many people walked past without noticing. She cleaned rooms, helped guests, and carried responsibilities with a quiet smile. Few people knew the challenges she faced. Fewer still knew how much strength it took for her to remain kind in a world that often ignored people like her. Grace never believed kindness made her weak. Her grandmother had taught her something she never forgot. A good heart is not a weakness. It is a choice you make every day. That belief guided her through difficult moments. She did not have wealth. She did not have influence. But she had something many powerful people had lost: compassion without expecting anything in return. Their worlds were never supposed to meet. Alexander belonged among luxury offices, private gatherings, and powerful conversations. Grace belonged behind the scenes, making sure everything worked smoothly while others received the recognition. But one rainy evening would change the direction of both their lives. After a long day of meetings, Alexander left the center of the city alone, searching for a quiet moment away from constant attention. The streets were nearly empty, and the sound of rain covered the usual noise of the city. For once, the man everyone feared looked less like a powerful figure and more like someone carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. Nearby, Grace was finishing her shift. She was tired, but she still noticed details others ignored. As she walked through the quiet streets, she saw someone who needed help. She did not know his name. She did not know his reputation. She did not know that the stranger standing in front of her was one of the most influential men in the city. She only saw a person, and that simple act of compassion would become the one moment Alexander Whitmore could never forget. Because sometimes the person society overlooks is the person who reveals the truth everyone else missed. And that night, the most powerful man in the city was about to discover the value of a woman the world had chosen not to see. Grace Carter did not know the name of the man she had helped that rainy evening. She did not know that the quiet stranger in front of her was someone whose decisions influenced powerful people across the city. To her, he was simply a person who looked exhausted and needed someone to show a little kindness. She offered him a place to sit, made sure he was comfortable, and spoke to him with the same respect she would offer anyone else. There was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to impress him, and no expectation of receiving anything in return. For Alexander Whitmore, that moment felt completely unfamiliar. He was used to people changing their behavior the second they recognized him. Some became nervous. Others became overly polite. Many wanted something from him. But Grace did not even ask his name. She simply treated him like a human being. As the rain continued outside, Alexander watched her carefully. He was used to reading people, understanding their intentions, and noticing hidden motives. Yet Grace confused him. There was nothing calculated about her actions. Her kindness seemed natural, almost impossible in the world he knew. "You do not know who I am," Alexander said quietly. Grace looked at him with a calm expression. "No, I do not. But I know you needed help." Those simple words stayed with him. For years, Alexander had believed that people only respected power. He had built his life around control because control felt safer than trust. But this woman, someone with no influence and no reason to care about him, had shown him a different kind of strength. The next morning, Alexander returned to his usual world. The luxury office, the important meetings, and the people waiting for his decisions were all still there. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet something felt different. His thoughts kept returning to the woman from the rainy street. He wanted to understand why her actions affected him so deeply. When his closest associates noticed his unusual silence, they were surprised. Alexander was not a man who allowed personal moments to distract him. He rarely spoke about emotions, and he never allowed strangers to leave an impression on him. But this time was different. "Find out who she is," Alexander finally said. The room became quiet. Everyone looked at him with surprise. They had expected him to discuss business, strategy, or matters connected to his powerful position. They did not expect him to ask about a woman with no connection to his world. "Who is she?" one person asked carefully. Alexander paused before answering. He remembered the way Grace looked at him, not with fear or admiration, but with simple human understanding. "She is the person who helped me when everyone else would have walked away." Hours later, information began to arrive. Her name was Grace Carter. She worked at a luxury hotel. She lived a modest life. She had no connection to powerful families or influential circles. To many people, she was ordinary. But Alexander was beginning to realize something important. The qualities that made Grace different were the same qualities that money could never buy: compassion, honesty, dignity. And for the first time in years, the man who had everything found himself searching for someone who wanted nothing from him. The world would soon discover why Alexander Whitmore, the mafia boss everyone feared, had given one unexpected order that left everyone speechless. He wanted to meet the woman who saw him as a person before she ever knew his name. The name Grace Carter carried no special meaning in the world Alexander Whitmore knew. She was not connected to powerful families, wealthy businesses, or influential circles. She did not appear in newspapers, attend exclusive events, or have people waiting for her approval. Yet after one simple act of kindness, she became the one person Alexander could not stop thinking about. When his team finally located her, Alexander expected to find someone who had a hidden reason for helping him. After all, that was how his world worked. People rarely offered kindness without wanting something in return. But the information they discovered only made him more curious. Grace worked long hours at the hotel, lived a quiet life, and spent much of her free time helping others in her community. There was no secret ambition behind her actions, no desire for attention, no attempt to gain favor from someone powerful. She simply believed people deserved compassion. Alexander sat silently in his office as he read through the details of her life. The room around him was filled with luxury, but the story in front of him reminded him of something he had forgotten. A person's value was not measured by their wealth or position. It was measured by the way they treated others when nobody was watching. Later that afternoon, Alexander arrived at the hotel where Grace worked. The employees immediately recognized him. His reputation had already reached places far beyond the city. The atmosphere changed the moment he entered. People became careful with their words, unsure of what he wanted. But Alexander was not there for business. He was there to find the woman who had treated him differently from everyone else. Grace was surprised when she saw him. She remembered the man from the rainy night, but she had no idea who he truly was. "I did not expect to see you again," she said with a polite smile. Alexander studied her expression. There was no excitement because of his status, no attempt to impress him. She was simply surprised to see someone familiar. "You helped me when you did not know anything about me," Alexander said. Grace looked slightly confused. "I only did what anyone should have done." Those words affected him more than she realized. In his world, people often celebrated rare acts of kindness because they had become uncommon. But Grace believed kindness was not something extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. As they spoke, Alexander learned more about her life. He discovered that Grace had experienced many moments where others failed to appreciate her. She had been overlooked because of her background and underestimated because of her position. Yet she never allowed those experiences to turn her heart cold. She still believed people could be better. Alexander found that belief remarkable. He had spent years protecting himself from disappointment by keeping everyone at a distance. Grace had faced disappointment and somehow chosen to remain compassionate. Before leaving, Alexander thanked her sincerely. Grace smiled and told him she was glad he was doing better. That simple response stayed with him. She was not impressed by his power. She was not interested in his reputation. She cared only that he was okay. For the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore felt seen without needing to prove anything. And that realization changed everything. Because the woman everyone overlooked had given the most powerful man in the city something he could never purchase: a moment of genuine humanity. The encounter with Grace Carter continued to stay in Alexander Whitmore's mind long after he left the hotel. For years, Alexander had trained himself to separate emotions from decisions. He believed hesitation created weakness, and he believed trust was something that could easily be used against a person. But Grace had challenged everything he thought he understood about people. She had no reason to treat him with kindness, yet she did. She had no idea who he was, yet she showed him respect. That simple truth was something Alexander could not ignore. Back at his private office, the people around him noticed a change. The Mafia boss, who was usually focused only on business, seemed distracted in a way they had never seen before. He was not thinking about money, influence, or reputation. He was thinking about a woman who worked quietly behind the scenes and somehow carried more genuine strength than many powerful people he had met. Meanwhile, Grace returned to her normal routine. She continued working at the hotel, helping guests, and taking care of responsibilities without expecting recognition. To her, the meeting with Alexander was simply a moment when one person helped another. She did not understand why someone so powerful would remember her. She did not realize that her simple kindness had created an impact far beyond what she imagined. A few days later, Alexander made a decision that surprised everyone around him. He wanted to invite Grace to a private conversation. Those closest to him were confused. They knew Alexander rarely allowed strangers into his personal world. They wondered what made this woman different. But Alexander understood something they did not. Grace was the first person in years who had looked at him without seeing a title, a reputation, or a source of power. When Grace arrived, she entered the elegant room with the same calm confidence she always carried. She was surrounded by luxury that was completely unfamiliar to her, but she did not let it change the way she acted. Alexander noticed immediately. Many people entered his world and became focused on what they could gain. Grace entered and remained exactly the same. "I wanted to thank you properly," Alexander said. Grace smiled. "You already thanked me." Alexander shook his head slightly. "No, I do not think I did." He paused, searching for the right words. "You reminded me that not everyone sees people as opportunities." Grace looked at him thoughtfully. She could see something others often missed. Behind the powerful image was a person who had spent years carrying responsibility alone. She did not feel sorry for him. She simply understood him. Their conversation continued longer than either expected. Alexander asked about her dreams, her experiences, and the things that mattered to her. Grace was surprised that someone like him would genuinely listen. She spoke about wanting a life where people were valued for who they were, not what they owned or what they could provide. Those words stayed with Alexander. His entire world had been built around status and influence, but Grace reminded him that the most meaningful things could not be measured. When the conversation ended, Alexander watched her leave and realized something important. The woman who had helped him was not special because she had saved him during a difficult moment. She was special because she remained kind in a world that had given her many reasons not to be. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander Whitmore wanted to know more about someone not because of what they could offer him, but because of who they truly were. The connection between Alexander Whitmore and Grace Carter continued to grow in a way neither of them expected. It was not built through wealth, status, or promises. It began with a simple moment when one person chose to help another without asking for anything in return. For Alexander, that moment had become a reminder of something he had forgotten. Not every interaction needed to be a negotiation. Not every relationship needed to have an advantage. Grace had shown him a different way of seeing the world. Meanwhile, Grace remained unaware of how much influence her actions had created. She continued living her ordinary life, arriving at work early, helping guests, and treating everyone with the same respect she had always shown. She never imagined that the man she helped would become someone who wanted to understand her story. One afternoon, Alexander visited the hotel again. This time, he did not arrive as a powerful figure surrounded by attention. He came quietly, hoping to have a genuine conversation. Grace noticed the difference immediately. The first time they met, she saw someone who needed help. This time, she saw someone who seemed interested in learning about another person's life. They sat together in a quiet area of the hotel, and Alexander asked questions he rarely asked anyone. He wanted to know what motivated her, what challenges she had overcome, and why she continued to be kind even when life had not always been kind to her. Grace hesitated at first. She was not used to someone with Alexander's influence caring about her experiences. But she slowly opened up. She shared that there were many moments when people judged her because of her background. Some assumed that because she worked as a maid, she had fewer dreams or fewer abilities. Others looked past her without ever trying to know her. But Grace explained that she refused to let other people's opinions decide who she became. People can misunderstand you, she said softly, but they cannot take away the person you choose to be. Alexander listened carefully. Those words reached deeper than she knew. He had spent years protecting his reputation and proving his strength to others. Yet Grace had faced rejection without allowing it to change her heart. He admired that more than any business achievement. As their conversations continued, Alexander began seeing the world differently. He started noticing the people around him who had always worked quietly without recognition. He began asking about employees' lives and showing appreciation for their efforts. Small changes appeared, but they represented something much bigger. Grace never asked him to change. She never gave him instructions or demanded anything from him. Her example alone showed him that power could be used with compassion. Some people around Alexander began questioning why he was spending time with someone outside his usual circle. They could not understand why the mafia boss known for his influence was interested in a woman who lived such a simple life. But Alexander understood something they did not. Grace was not valuable because he noticed her. She was valuable because she had always been. One evening, as Alexander watched the city lights from his office window, he realized the truth. He had spent years searching for loyalty among powerful people, but he found genuine kindness in someone society overlooked. And that discovery changed the way he saw everything. Because sometimes the person with the least power is the person who reveals the greatest strength. The changes in Alexander Whitmore became impossible for the people around him to ignore. Those who had known him for years noticed that something was different, even though they could not explain exactly what had changed. The mafia boss who once kept everyone at a distance was now paying attention to the people who had always worked quietly around him. He asked questions. He listened to answers. He began seeing individuals instead of simply seeing their roles. But while Alexander was changing, Grace Carter was still learning how unusual her influence had become. She never believed she had done anything extraordinary. To her, helping someone in need was simply the right thing to do. She did not see herself as someone capable of changing the life of one of the most powerful men in the city. Yet Alexander saw what others had missed. Grace carried a strength that did not come from money, status, or recognition. It came from the way she treated people when there was nothing to gain. One evening, Alexander invited Grace to a small gathering at one of his private properties. He wanted her to meet some of the people closest to him, not because he wanted to show her off, but because he wanted them to understand why she had become important to him. When Grace arrived, she immediately noticed the difference between her world and his. The room was filled with influential people wearing expensive clothing and discussing important matters. For a moment, she wondered if she truly belonged there. But Alexander noticed her hesitation. "You do not need to become someone else to enter this room," he told her. "You already deserve to be here." Those words meant more to Grace than he realized. For years, she had been made to feel that she was less important because of her position. She had learned to stay quiet, work hard, and avoid drawing attention. But Alexander was showing her something different. Respect was not something reserved for people with power. It was something every person deserved. Throughout the evening, Grace spoke with guests naturally. She did not try to impress anyone. She simply shared her thoughts and treated everyone with the same kindness she always carried. Alexander watched as people who initially underestimated her slowly changed their opinions. They realized that her value was never connected to her job or her background. It was connected to her character. Later that night, Alexander and Grace stood outside on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights below reflected across the streets, creating a peaceful moment away from the noise inside. "Do you ever wonder why you helped me that night?" Alexander asked. Grace smiled slightly. "Because someone needed help. Even if you knew who I was," he asked. She thought for a moment. "I would still have helped you. A person is a person before they are a reputation." Alexander remained quiet. Those words reminded him of how much his perspective had changed. For most of his life, he believed people only cared about the image he represented. Grace had proven that someone could care about the person underneath. As days passed, Alexander found himself making choices differently. He became more thoughtful, more patient, and more aware of how his actions affected others. He did not change because Grace demanded it. He changed because meeting her reminded him of the person he wanted to become. And Grace discovered something as well. The world had always told her that kindness made her weak. But standing beside Alexander, she finally understood the truth. Kindness was not weakness. It was the quiet strength that could reach even the most guarded hearts. The days that followed brought a quiet transformation that even Alexander Whitmore's closest associates could not ignore. The man who once seemed impossible to understand was becoming someone different, not because he had lost his strength, but because he had discovered a better way to use it. For years, Alexander believed that respect came from reputation and influence. He believed people listened because they feared disappointing him. But Grace Carter showed him something he had never considered. The strongest connections were not created through power. They were created through trust. Grace continued living her life with the same humility she always carried. She still arrived early at work, still helped others whenever she could, and still treated every person with patience. The difference was that now, more people began to notice the qualities she had always possessed. Those who once overlooked her started seeing the confidence behind her kindness. Alexander watched this change with admiration because he understood that Grace had never needed his approval to have value. She already had it. One afternoon, Alexander visited the hotel where Grace worked. He noticed something that stayed with him. Many employees worked hard every day without receiving recognition, yet Grace always found a way to make them feel appreciated. She remembered small details about people. She asked about their families. She noticed when someone seemed tired or needed encouragement. To Grace, these things were natural. To Alexander, they were lessons he had spent years forgetting. Later that evening, Alexander invited Grace to walk through the city with him. It was a simple moment, far away from formal meetings and luxury events. For once, he was not the powerful man surrounded by expectations. He was simply Alexander. "You know what I find surprising?" he said as they walked beneath the city lights. Grace looked at him. "What? You helped me without knowing my name. Most people try to understand what I can do for them before they decide how to treat me." Grace smiled gently. "Maybe that is why people need kindness. Sometimes we forget that everyone is carrying something we cannot see." Alexander became quiet. Those words reflected everything he had learned since meeting her. He had spent years assuming everyone around him had hidden intentions. Grace reminded him that not every person was looking for an advantage. Some people simply wanted to do what was right. However, not everyone around Alexander welcomed the changes they saw. Some questioned why he spent so much time with Grace. They believed someone from her background could never understand his world. They judged her before knowing her. But Alexander no longer saw those opinions the same way. In the past, he might have ignored the situation or allowed others to decide what mattered. Now he understood that silence could sometimes support unfair judgments. During an important gathering, someone made a careless comment about Grace's position and suggested she did not belong among influential people. The room became quiet. Everyone waited for Alexander's response. He looked toward Grace first. She remained calm, standing with the same dignity she had shown from the beginning. Then Alexander spoke. "A person's worth is not determined by their position. It is determined by their character." His words surprised everyone. For the first time, people saw that Alexander was not simply defending Grace. He was defending a belief he had finally learned. Respect should never depend on status. And in that moment, Grace realized something important. She had spent years believing she was invisible. But the right person had finally seen her clearly. And the man everyone feared had learned that the greatest strength in the room was not power. It was kindness. The moment Alexander Whitmore spoke in defense of Grace Carter changed the way many people viewed him. Those who had spent years watching him build his reputation through control and confidence saw something they had never expected. The Mafia boss who once avoided personal connections had chosen to stand beside someone because of her character, not because of her influence. But for Alexander, that moment was not about proving something to others. It was about accepting something he had finally understood. Grace did not need anyone to convince the world that she mattered. She had always carried her own strength. She simply needed people to see it. After the gathering, Grace thanked Alexander for speaking up. She expected him to say he had only done what was necessary, but his response surprised her. "I did not say those words because you needed protection," he told her. I said them because they were true. Grace looked at him quietly, realizing how much he had changed. The man she first met was someone who believed emotions created weakness. Now he was someone willing to express what he believed, even when it revealed a more human side of himself. As time passed, Alexander continued making changes in his own world. He began creating opportunities for people who were often ignored. He listened more carefully during meetings. He asked for opinions instead of assuming he already had all the answers. These changes seemed small to outsiders, but those who knew him understood how meaningful they were. Grace never took credit for his transformation. She always believed people had the ability to choose who they wanted to become. She simply reminded Alexander of a part of himself that had been hidden for years. One evening, Alexander invited Grace to visit a quiet garden behind his private residence. Unlike the grand spaces where important people gathered, this place was peaceful and simple. There were flowers, trees, and a small pathway surrounded by soft lights. It was the first place where Alexander felt he could forget about expectations. I spent most of my life thinking that being strong meant needing nobody, Alexander said. Grace listened carefully. But you showed me that strength can also mean trusting someone. Grace smiled. Maybe strength is not about carrying everything alone. Maybe it is about knowing what truly matters. Alexander looked at her and realized how much those words represented their journey. He had built walls around himself because he believed they protected him. But those same walls had kept him away from genuine connections. Grace had never forced those walls to disappear. She had simply shown him that he no longer needed them. Meanwhile, Grace also experienced a transformation. For years, she had accepted being overlooked because she believed that was simply her place in life. But Alexander's respect reminded her that humility did not mean allowing others to make her feel small. She could remain kind while still recognizing her own worth. The two of them had changed each other in ways neither expected. Alexander learned that power without compassion felt empty. Grace learned that kindness and confidence could exist together. When people looked at them, they no longer saw a powerful man and an ordinary woman from different worlds. They saw two people who had discovered something rare. They had found respect before anything else. And that foundation became stronger than any reputation, title, or expectation. Months after the night when their lives unexpectedly crossed, Alexander Whitmore and Grace Carter found themselves standing in a place neither of them could have imagined before. The man who once believed power was the only way to survive had discovered something far more valuable. The woman who once believed she was invisible had finally understood that her worth had never depended on how others saw her. Their journey was never about changing one person into someone else. It was about two people discovering the best parts of themselves through a connection built on respect. Alexander continued to lead his organization with the same confidence and intelligence people had always known. But the difference was clear. He no longer measured success only by influence or control. He began measuring it by the people he helped and the trust he earned. Those around him noticed that the man who once kept everyone at a distance had become someone who listened, cared, and understood. Grace remained the same person at her core. She was still humble, thoughtful, and compassionate. She never chased attention or wanted recognition for the kindness she showed. But now she walked with a confidence she had not always carried. She understood that being humble did not mean accepting being overlooked. It meant knowing her value while continuing to treat others with kindness. The people who once ignored Grace began seeing her differently. They realized that her strength had never come from wealth or position. It came from her character, her patience, and her ability to remain good even when life had not always been fair. One morning, Alexander and Grace stood together in the garden where they had shared so many honest conversations. The sunlight moved gently across the trees, creating a peaceful moment that felt far away from the noise of the city. Alexander looked around and remembered the person he used to be. A man surrounded by luxury, but separated from genuine connection. A man who had everything people wanted, but still felt something important was missing. I used to think people respected me because of what I had built, Alexander said quietly. But now I understand that true respect comes from how you treat people when you have the power to choose differently. Grace smiled. She knew those words represented the biggest change in him. He was no longer simply a man known by his title. He had become someone who understood the responsibility that came with his influence. Their story became something people remembered, not because a powerful man noticed a woman from a different world, but because both of them proved that kindness and dignity could create change. Grace had never needed Alexander to give her value. She already possessed it. Alexander had never needed someone to make him powerful. He already was. What they gave each other was something much deeper. She reminded him of his humanity. He reminded her that the world could finally recognize her strength. And that was the lesson everyone around them eventually understood. The people society overlooks can carry the greatest wisdom. The quietest acts of kindness can create the biggest transformations. Because sometimes, the person who saves someone's life is not only saving a moment. They are opening the door to an entirely different future. And that day, the world remembered that true power was not found in fear or status. It was found in compassion, humility, and the courage to see the value in another human being.